Welcome to LookAhead Radio with Tom Arms and Lockwood Phillips.
We've been focusing on issues here in North Carolina and, of course, in the country. We're going to now move to around the world with Tom Arms of LookAhead Radio joining us in just a moment with viewpoints from around the world with Tom Arms. And again, with LookAhead Radio, which you hear every Friday afternoon here on the talk station and radio stations around the country, expanding interest in his program. Joining us now from London, England, where it's not quite midnight, but getting close to it. Tom, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Lockwood. It's always a pleasure.
And tell us the temperature and climate in London.
It's starting to get a little bit cooler, but we haven't pulled the sweaters out from underneath the mothballs yet. So it's becoming a little bit more autumnal. The sun is still shining. We've had a little bit of rain, but only a few. It's been a very nice fall, autumn, summer. It's been very pleasant. Still is.
Okay, so climate change is natural there in London too. We go from summer to fall to winter. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, very quickly, I did see, and this is not in our list of conversation topics, that the mayor of London is in the States. As a matter of fact, was throwing out the ball at a baseball game. Is that covered there in? No,
I haven't seen it here. I haven't seen it here. I can tell you, I know Sadiq Khan quite well. He's a really nice man. He's turning out to be a good mayor too.
Well, of course,
I did know that he was planning to go to the States to help Hillary's campaign.
Yep. And so he was throwing baseballs. All right, let's talk about, since you brought up Hillary's campaign, what's the coverage in Europe about that as we speak?
They covered it. You've been asking about it for the last 3 weeks. They covered the Clinton Foundation. They had a piece on Channel 4 News tonight.
3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. Okay.
It lasted about 10 minutes. They had about a 10-minute slot on it. In which they basically said there were questions about her using the fund or the fund being used or whatever to sell access to the Secretary of State. They stressed that there was no indication and no one has actually said or has come up with any proof that any policies have been changed as a result of it. And they also drew attention to some question marks over Trump's charitable foundation as well. So that is the answer to the question you have been asking for 3 weeks.
But there was no sense of unseemliness about that activity?
No, I don't think it was right for them. I don't think they were going to take that attitude. They took the angle that this was trouble, that it was bad news for Hillary, that it was trouble which was not going to go away very easily.
All right, and then before we go to this break here in just a few moments, what about the coverage of her health and conditions of her health? Was that
that hasn't, except for the time when she had pneumonia. It hasn't been mentioned since.
Interesting. So nothing new there as well. We're going to get into the topics. By the way, I know that you want to chat about the story and the events in Charlotte, where, of course, you have...
Well, I think I want to ask you questions about that.
You have family there. Let's talk very briefly, and we'll have to break this up, but let's talk very briefly about the bombings in New York. Has that been covered there in Europe?
Yes, in great detail. Ooh. And the fact you're still looking for two people. Something which did get a lot of coverage was the fact that the man who phoned the police was an immigrant, who turned in Ahmed Rahmani, that he was an Indian immigrant. That's gotten a fair amount of play here. But it has been covered in great detail in the fact that he was an Afghan refugee. Another thing which got a great deal of play this week was a lot of negative play was Donald Jr.'s
comment
tweet
about
Skittles.
All right, we're going to get to that in just a moment. You're listening to Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms, and you're welcome to join us by phone, 252 area code 247-7282, 910 area code 353-4674, toll free 800-818-2255. Viewpoints Around the World. Stay with us.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
This is Tom Arms with LookAheadNews.com's World Report for the week beginning the 26th of September. Look Ahead broadcasts tomorrow's news today so that you can plan to participate. The week starts with the first Clinton-Trump debate at Hofstra University in Maryland, but quickly moves to South America, where the Colombian government will on Monday ratify a peace accord with FARC guerrillas to end the 50-year-old civil war. The agreement will be confirmed in a plebiscite on Sunday. In the first half of next week, Algiers hosts an energy forum where ministers from OPEC and non-OPEC countries will discuss the world oil glut. It's a big week for referendum election. On Monday, Azerbaijan votes on extending the powers of President Ilham Aliyev, and the Italian government sets the date on its referendum for constitutional changes. And on Sunday, Hungarians vote on whether or not to accept EU quotas on refugees, and there's a rerun of the Austrian presidential election on the same day. The International Criminal Court on Tuesday issues its final verdict to Ahmed al-Faqi al-Mahdi for his destruction of the Muslim treasures of Timbuktu. At the start of next month, Ford will start closing down its Australian operations after 87 years in the country. The company says production costs are just too high. Next Saturday, a boatload of women activists arrives off the coast of Gaza Strip in an attempt to break Israel's naval blockade of the Palestinian territory. Another protest starts in Malaysia when protesters start a 7-week motorcade through the country, calling for the resignation of Prime Minister Najib Razak. And finally, ownership of the Internet changes hands. It has been American property, but from the 1st of October, it will be owned by the United Nations. And that was next week's News Today, so that you can plan to participate. Stay tuned after this message for LookAheadNews.com's expanded world analysis.
Quick, what do these sounds have in common? These are the sounds of geography. Geography helps us understand connections between people and places. But our kids aren't getting enough of it. Half can't locate Japan or India, and 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. So we created MyWonderfulWorld.org to give kids the power of global knowledge. Go to MyWonderfulWorld.org to learn more. It's a wonderful world.
This is Tom Arms with LookAheadNews.com's expanded world analysis for the week beginning the 26th of September. Look Ahead broadcasts tomorrow's news today so that you can plan to participate. It's presidential debate time in America, with Hillary maintaining a steady 5 to 6 point lead over the Donald. The two candidates will gather at Maryland's Hofstra University to debate the rather vague subjects of America's direction, achieving prosperity, and securing America. The debate is on Monday. For half a century, a civil war has raged in Colombia between successive governments and the Revolutionary Armed Forces, aka FARC. After years of negotiation in Havana, the Colombian parliament will on Monday ratify a peace accord between the two sides, and then on Sunday the finishing touches will be put on the deal with a nationwide plebiscite. Meanwhile, in Italy, the government of Matteo Renzi is expected to set the date for his planned referendum to constitutional changes that will weaken the blocking power of the Italian Senate. The referendum is expected in November or December, and observers are saying that it is likely to end up a public vote of confidence in Renzi's government. There will be 2 referendums next week. The first in Azerbaijan is on extending the powers of President Ilham Aliyev. He wants his term extended from 5 to 7 years, and the creation of a vice-presidential position. Aliyev has been accused by a number of groups of corruption and human rights abuses. There will also be a referendum on Sunday in Hungary on the EU quota system for resettling refugees. The right-wing populist Prime Minister Viktor Orban has refused to take any refugees, erected a fence to keep them out, and posted 10,000 armed police and soldiers along the border. EU unity faces another threat in Austria. On the same day as the Hungarian referendum, there will be a rerun of May's presidential elections, after irregularities were discovered.
The May poll was won by the Green Party's pro-European Alexander Van der Bellen by just 31,000 votes. Far-right Freedom Party candidate Norbert Hofer wants a Brexit-style vote on Austrian membership of the EU. There has been an Israeli naval blockade of Gaza since 2007, and numerous failed attempts to break it. Next weekend there will be another attempt by a group of 24 women activists who have sailed from Barcelona aboard their Mao in the Zaytuna, which means hope and olive tree. A motorcade protest will start in Malaysia on Saturday. The pro-democracy group Bersha is demanding that Prime Minister Najib Razak resign after allegations that he stole up to $3.5 billion from the state-owned Malaysian Development Fund. And that was next week's News Today from LookAheadNews.com, so that you can plan to participate in the world around you. Stay tuned for Viewpoints Around the World with myself and Lockwood Phillips.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio with us this evening for Viewpoints Around the World. And Tom, as we were going to the break, we brought up the topic of this bombings and explosives in New York, New Jersey. We also had the knifing in Minnesota. And then you also note that the other story that's playing heavily there in Europe and London. And I differentiate the continent from the United Kingdom, the British Isles. But I'm curious, Tom, the story of the events in New York City and New Jersey and of course Minnesota as well, is there any comparative analysis in the stories to what took place in Nice, France, or Paris, or in other areas of the continent particularly, or are they seen as separate activities, is my first question, and then we'll get to the topic of Donald Trump's son, Donald Jr. But first, the bombings, how have they been played, and is a comparison?
At this time, they're being reported as separate incidents. That's not to say that at some point in the not too distant future there'll be connections made. But this time, they're being reported as separate incidents.
Is there any connection between that and the events in Paris and in Germany, and I would argue even there in the United Kingdom, related to leadership and the topic of refugees? And we're going to get into that a little later on as well. But I'm just curious if there's any connection there, because I contend that one of the issues associated with Brexit, that's the British exit from the EU, was the topic of refugees and the concerns. And we're seeing this in Germany as well.
Yes, but there's no connections being made to that at the moment, other than they're noticing that not much is being said by Donald Trump on the subject. That's been, at least not that's been reported here. He's keeping they were expecting him to sort of jump in and say something along the lines of, more or less something supporting Donald Jr.'s comments on Skittles. He's toned down a bit, and there's been comment on that in the press here.
Very interesting. It's an observation we've made as well, the discipline that he seems to have applied to his campaign. No, he has made mention, though, that his opponent is in favor of increasing the number of refugees moving into the country. And, of course, this applies to the conversations happening as we speak at the UN. But we'll get to that a little later on. Let's talk about Donald Jr.'s comments related to Skittles, in which he described immigrants as Skittles, many different varieties of individuals. And he said what we're dealing with is an instances of a few poisoned Skittles. What is so outrageous, and what's I shouldn't say outrageous, what has been the response to that in the European press?
I'll be honest and say, and I'm fairly liberal, and I'm a bit surprised at the outrage. I think it's out of all proportion, but basically it's thought of as demeaning to the refugees to compare them to a candy.
Okay.
I think that's the argument.
Okay.
I think that's a bit.
Okay.
That's a bit of a weak link, to be honest.
Oh, it is.
And they were just looking for things, which people do. If you don't like someone,
Yeah.
you look for something not to like.
Yeah, exactly. All right. I can't imagine people not liking any of the Trump family. The subject goes to also, since we're dealing with international issues, and we've got to talk about the topics of Syria here in a few minutes, Gary Johnson's remarks about response to Aleppo. What is Aleppo?
Oh, that
how does that been played?
Into what is Aleppo? I watched that video 3 times. I couldn't believe it. He said it twice. What is Aleppo? What is Aleppo? It plays into a deep-seated fear on the part of the Europeans that the American leaders just don't care, don't know, and don't care about the rest of the world.
I can appreciate that, especially in light of the topic of refugees. Let's jump to that topic here for a few minutes. We mentioned the issue of the UN summit that's underway this week and concern associated with refugees. And it was interesting, and you may not have seen this at this point. It was yesterday. The President of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama, made note of the fact that the world has fallen down in its responsibilities for maintaining. And let me just remark on something. Someone from the United Kingdom told me last week this is the largest number of refugees historically ever. I don't know who that was.
That was me.
Oh, it was you, Tom. Yes. And
no, I certainly on record. I actually double-checked that after I said it to you because you were doubtful. It's certainly the largest
recorded.
That recorded.
Right.
It's the largest ever recorded, but they've only been keeping records since 1951, I think.
But still, 65 million refugees, I think, is the number that's been.
63.5.
Okay. So you're going. We used to be friends. Now you're going to quibble over 1.5 million refugees. Tom, what about this? The president has criticized other countries about their failure to be more open. How is that being received in Europe where the problem is at your doorstep, literally?
Well, it varies from country to country. But basically, everyone thinks Obama's a wonderful person at the moment because, he's coming over as all humanitarian. And he's the one who's pushed through this additional aid. And however, if you're Hungarian or Czech or Polish, then you hate refugees. They don't want to have any, and so they don't like Obama at all.
Well, I was going to say they've been lectured. I don't know that. Does he have the cachet, the political cachet, to carry off that kind of a lecture?
Yes, he does. Wow. And the fact is that he's gotten a lot of support, and he's gotten countries like Australia and I think some South American countries to agree to take some additional refugees. And that's very important, especially important from a European point of view, because they've been taking the brunt of these refugees. And what's happened in New York is it's been dissipated a bit for them. Other countries are saying, okay, Europe, you've done your bit. Germany, you've taken 800,000. I don't know how many Sweden and France have taken, but they've taken quite a few. You've done your bit. Yeah, we agree. We've got to take some too, and we've got to give some money as well. It's not just a European problem. It's a world problem.
It is a world problem. The issue here, of course, is the fallout from this and such situations such as the concerns with the bombings in New York, New Jersey. And by the way, as we wrap it up, Chancellor Merkel in Germany herself has even now acknowledged that maybe she needs to rethink the refugee. Am I correct?
When you go back to the Skittles and everything else, there's a professor at UNC, Charles Kurzman, who did some research on this. And basically, now the research ended at it was the number of people who've been killed in the U.S. between 9/11 and the start of 2015, have been killed by jihadist terrorists, is 37.
37. Oh, okay.
And he compared 37 between the end of between 9/11 and the beginning of 2015. There were 37. And he compared that to 190,000 run-of-the-mill homicides over the same period. Okay. He asserts that the threat from Islamic terrorism within the greater context of the number of people who die violently is minuscule.
All right, Tom, stay with us. You're listening, of course, Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
They say the best things in life are free. So, hey, why are we paying so much for our basic information and entertainment needs? The average cable TV bill has more than doubled in the last 10 years. The price of movie tickets keeps going up. So, exactly what is free today anyway? Well, you're listening to it. Local radio. Support the advertisers that support this radio station. And keep listening. We won't send you a bill. There are still some things you just shouldn't have to pay for.
We now return to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio, and again, heard every Friday afternoon here on the talk station. His program heard in stations across the country, growing an expanding program. Tom, thank you for staying with us. This is a variety of issues here that I want to chat with you about it. The aftermath of the Bratislava summit, and just finish up with that. What is coming? What do you think is going to be the aftermath of that?
Could I just make one point about what we were talking about before, which was the refugees? Because I think this is very important. There's a chap at Oxford University called Alexander Betts who's taking a leading role in this. And he's saying basically you need a systemic overhaul of the structures to deal with refugees because they're based on a convention that was drawn up in the aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War era. And things have completely changed since then. You've got different types of people, greater numbers of people coming from different places. And so he's calling for basically a complete overhaul of things like the UN High Commission for Refugees.
Okay, but let's stay with that for a moment. You know, you say they're coming from different places. They're coming from predominantly, and I would be so bold as to say 98%. From the Middle East. And the issue here is that it's one segment of the world. And by the way, it's a culturally different segment to the countries to which they are escaping. And
not true.
Oh,
not true.
Go for
They're
it.
not predominantly. No, there are a lot of them coming from Africa. And I suppose you can say Afghanistan is the Middle East as well. But I would say
yes.
Afghanistan as a country is not as advanced as a lot of the countries in the Middle East. And so the people who were displaced after World War II were Europeans with greater skills. And you're right, they were coming from a greater culture, or from the same culture, not a greater culture, but the same culture. And that is something which has to be taken into account in any systemic review of the situation of the convention.
But we are looking at a mixture that is so rare and so, so raw and different that I don't see how you can adjust the system. I think the real issue, and this is not to get into a debate with you, Tom, is that the problems that have created these refugees need to be solved, which, of course, segues beautifully into a question. What about Syria? I mean, this is out of Syria, out of Iraq, out of Iran, and I might add Libya, Egypt. We're seeing.
I couldn't agree with you more, Lockwood. That if you want to resolve the problem,
we have got to
solve that. What you have to do is create better living conditions. In the places where they're coming from. I don't want to leave.
I'm sorry. It's not so much living conditions. It's the form of government that has created this. We have, you've got a situation in Syria where the Syrian leader, really does not care about his country or his people. He cares about himself. I would say arguably that is the case in Iran. It would be definitely the case in Libya. It would be the case in Turkey. I mean, we are dealing with people who are led by countries, I'm going to be so bold to say, megalomaniacs who don't care about anyone else but themselves.
I agree, but I don't think you can force regime change on these people.
Well, you
end up with a situation like you have in Iraq at the moment.
Well,
it's a very difficult balancing act.
If you don't have if you don't have regime change, we're going to continue to have more refugees.
I think what you have to do is try and improve the economic medical conditions and things like that, and that the political changes will follow on from that.
Well, there is yet another flood of refugees, and let's touch on this one, and that having to be with North Korea. I am very fearful of what's going on in North Korea. Let's talk about the reactions of, and I've kind of stretched on this one, but there is a connection. The recent recent rocket test, and North Korea is definitely, flexing its muscles, as is Russia to some degree, and China. But North Korea, it looks like they could be the focal point for a major conflagration.
You're spot on for a change, Lockwood. Well done.
Always on, but okay.
No, and that is why. I mean, there are 30 million North Koreans, and something like they've got a huge fence. There's an 880-mile border between China and North Korea, and they've got a barbed wire fence between the two, a Trump-type wall, and still 30 to 60,000 North Koreans, and that's the minimum figure. Nobody knows the exact figure, but some people say it could be as many as 100,000 every year manage to get over that wall or over that fence and escape into China. And one of the reasons the Chinese are, refusing to stop trading and stop giving aid to the North Koreans is because they are really worried that what might happen is that the North Koreans will just completely collapse, and they get 30 million starving North Koreans flooding across the border that they're going to have to look after. And they're also concerned that what might happen is that it will push the Korean leadership into a situation where they almost have to use their nuclear weapons to save face.
Wow.
It's very interesting. The question is, are the North Koreans mad? Well, there's a really interesting article by a chap called Max Fisher in the New York Times.
When you say mad, are we talking insane or angry?
Well, irrational.
Okay, irrational.
Insane.
Okay.
Yes. A lot of people say, Kim Jong-un is insane. He's not. He's basically, according to Max Fisher in the New York Times, and I thought it was a really good article, he argued that he has to have the country on a permanent war footing in order to basically keep the people from getting dissatisfied from the fact that they're not able to keep up economically with the South. And so he's constantly feeding them these stories that they're about to be attacked. And if they're about to be attacked, then they have to have weapons all the time. And the bigger and better the weapons, the safer they are. The problem is that, you're going to get to the situation where there might be a little political accident and the weapons might have to go off.
That is a grave fear, and we are watching this with a great deal of interest. All right, since we're that part of the world, let's talk about China and the impact all this is happening. And what about their economy? I'm seeing a note here that there's some economic issues in China.
Yeah, there's good and bad news coming out of China. The worst news is that there is a major, or we're on the brink of a major banking crisis. Now, there's something called the Bank for International Settlements, and they basically keep track of all the banks around the world. And they have a something called the credit to gap ratio measurement. And if you have a measurement of over 10, then there's a potential danger to your banking system. The Chinese are measured at 30.1.
It's three times the
danger level.
Whoa.
Okay, and basically it's a difference between how much you borrowed and what your GDP is. And their debts are in the trillions of dollars.
And they in the process hold a lot of U.S. debt in their asset portfolio.
That's right. Now the good news is that unlike the United States and Britain and France, they can probably take on a bit more debt because the banks are owned by the government. And so if worse comes to worse, the government can step in. But if they do that, they unbalance the market economy, the world market economy. So, we really don't know what's going to happen there. The other news is that two of the big steel producers in China have merged or are going to merge. Now, as you probably know, one of the big problems facing the world steel industry is overproduction of steel,
Right.
and especially in China, and the Chinese have been dumping it. Well, they're going to cut back on steel production. And this is something that Obama raised when he met with the Chinese president recently at the G20 summit.
All right.
And it looks like he did have some impact there. So they're going to be, that's good news, is that Chinese are cutting back on their steel production.
The other aspect of this, and I just saw this in a note from you, and it relates here to a story in North Carolina, as a matter of fact. There are plans to erect 500 wind turbines off Cape Hatteras here in eastern North Carolina. Before we wrap it up here, about a minute to go, I see that China is spending a lot of money on wind power as well.
2 wind turbines are being built every hour, faster than anywhere else in the world. Now, this is good news and bad news, because obviously, it's part of the green revolution.
Right.
But it also means that we're going to continue to have this oil glut for a while. And the depressed oil prices are having an effect on the world economy. And they're just a bit too low, and it means that countries such as Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, which have been traditional engines, if you like, of world growth, because they've always been awash in a surplus of money, are not anymore.
And then we have what's happening in South America, particularly Venezuela. All right, Tom Arms from Look Ahead Radio with us this evening. Look Ahead Look Ahead program heard every Friday afternoon here on the Talk Station and other stations around the country. Stay with us as we wrap things up with viewpoints around the world.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
Observations of an Expat by Tom Arms. It's as if Brexit was a loose thread in the complex political tapestry of the European Union. The Eurosceptics worked Britain loose, and now they're pulling with all their might on the rest of the fabric. The next thread could well be Italy. Next week, Prime Minister Matteo Renzi announces the date of a referendum to introduce a major and much-needed change to the Italian constitution. The Italians have a penchant for drifting from political crisis to political crisis. This is partly caused by the fact that the 315-strong upper chamber, the Senate, regularly blocks the work of the 630 deputies in the lower house. So Matteo Renzi has come up with a plan to reduce senatorial power by slashing its membership to an indirectly elected 100 and turning it into a largely consultative body. He won a parliamentary majority for the plan, but failed to achieve the 2/3 required for it to be enacted. Not to worry, says Renzi. Article 138 of the Constitution allows the government to go over the heads of fellow politicians and appeal to the public in a referendum. The problem is that other issues are muddying the waters in much the same way as they did with Britain's Brexit vote. Most of these issues have nasty economic roots. Italy has yet to set foot on the post-2008 road to recovery. In fact, in the past 8 years, its economy has shrunk by almost 1%. The official unemployment rate is a scary 11.4%. And some economists put the unofficial level at a nightmarish 20 to 25%. A contracting economy has lots of repercussions. For a start, lower tax revenues for an overstretched treasury. Another is banks landed with mounting bad debts as Italian businesses collapse. The bad debt mountain currently totals $350 billion, a fifth of Italy's annual economic activity. Particularly hard hit is Italy's third largest financial institution, the Banca Monte dei Paschi. It desperately needs cash to stay afloat. Renzi wants to prop it up with government funds, but Italy is part of the Eurozone, and government bailouts are against the rules until the bank's creditors have borne the brunt of the losses. The problem is that in Italy the creditors are not the big institutions as in other countries, but small investors. Playing by Euro rules would be a political disaster. Then there's the immigration problem. Most of Europe's attention is focused on displaced Syrians currently detained in Turkey and anxiously seeking homes in northern Europe. But even before the Syrian civil war, Italy was trying to cope with North African boat people crossing the Mediterranean. In 1 month alone, in 2016, 24,440 refugees landed on Italian soil. Last week, Matteo Renzi flew to the EU summit in Bratislava to put his case for help with both the immigration and banking problem. But his fellow European leaders turned their backs on him. As far as the banks were concerned, German Chancellor Angela Merkel simply declared that rules is rules. Immigration was swept under the carpet, and instead there was a lot of talk about an EU army. Renzi was furious. He refused to appear at the post-summit press conference and dismissed the gathering as no more than a pleasant boat ride down the Danube. He is seriously worried that his constitutional referendum will be hijacked by the economic and immigration issues. This can only benefit Italy's fast-rising Eurosceptic five-star movement, which has pledged to pull Italy out of the Eurozone. Not a full-scale exit, but a big step in that direction. Renzi has promised to resign if he loses the referendum. The five-star movement is well placed to make big gains in a subsequent election. Euro-fanatics such as Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker may achieve the federal Europe they desperately desire, but their inflexibility is likely to result in the European flag having a lot fewer stars than it has at the moment.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Look Ahead Radio with Tom Arms, but also with viewpoints around the world. We're chatting with him about the events of the past week, and we'll get into issues Friday evening of what to expect next week. But Tom, I want to talk to you very quickly. We were chatting about the economy in China. You have a little note here about Britain and plastic money, and then I want to get to the topic of a North Carolina event. But tell us something about Britain and plastic money. What gives?
Well, they've started printing what used to be paper money on pieces of plastic.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Now,
there's a good reason for it. It isn't worn out the way paper is.
Right.
And so it lasts about 10 times as long as paper money did, so they don't have to print as much. So they save money on the printing.
Does it fold?
They put it through washing machines, and it comes out looking perfectly laundered.
Does it fold like paper money?
It folds like paper money.
Okay.
You can't eat it because a newsreader got one of the new plastic pieces of paper and tried to eat it in front of the camera, and it didn't work.
No. Okay.
He said it tasted horrible.
I can imagine. All right, let's move to another item. And you asked me about this in a last-minute missive this afternoon. The Charlotte riots. What is the news there in Europe? It's been leading the national news here in this country. And, of course, it's a topic that you and I both have talked about related to Charlotte. We have family in the vicinity. What is the news and how is it being covered there?
It's leading the news here, too.
Really?
Yeah. It's basically, but it's an extension of the Black Lives Matter, the conflict between the black community and the police. So it's carrying on from that, and the shooting recently in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is part of it as well. It's seen as an extension of the '60s civil rights movement, and a serious problem for the United States.
How is it there in, let's pick on the United Kingdom. What's it like there relative to racial tensions or racial disparities? Is there such in?
Yes, but they don't have guns. Well, I mean, when I say they don't have guns, obviously there's always going to be a few guns.
Right.
But because of gun control, you don't have the same problem. And, we had some riots here a couple of years ago, and it started over the same thing. It was a black youth who was shot by police.
The majority of the riots that we learn about here in the States are usually associated with that that activity that you call it an athletic activity. We call it soccer, football, and periodically some disputes over rugby. That's what we hear are the riots. Most of the cause the riots.
There were some riots, but it hasn't been a problem here in the UK. It hadn't been a serious problem in the UK for 20, 25 years.
Okay, I want to go to another issue altogether, and this is my topic this evening, and so we'll wrap it up with the conversation I had earlier this evening about the topic of the riots in Charlotte, and you mentioned the issue of guns. The interesting thing, Tom, is that the vast majority, again, a big number, 98% of these events, begin by the failure of the civilians in the particular case not complying with police officers. And it's an attitude we fear here in the States. This is something that I'm stating, an attitude I fear that is anti-authoritarian, that there's a fear in this country that we're losing control. Now, I'm curious, how is it in Europe and particularly there in the United Kingdom? When police officers speak, do people listen?
Well, it depends. Yes. I mean, there are communities here who are anti-police just as there are in America. I think we talked last week about the Black Lives Matter movement coming to Britain.
Right.
And in some areas where there's a very high a very large black community, there's a great deal of distrust of the police. A lot of the same distrust that you feel in America. And they talk back to the police.
Wow.
They don't listen to the police. They make rude comments to the police. All those sort of things. I don't know if you remember, Lockwood, but there was a time in the 60s. Do you remember the 60s?
Oh, yes.
By the way, we used to demonstrate as students and call police pigs.
I know this, unfortunately, I think an outpouring of or outshoot of that very event. Stay with us.
Look Ahead Radio is a production of the Talk Station.